The power of love is very real. It does a lot more than just cause nosebleeds and make babies. And in fact, there are a few select individuals in the One Piece world who are capable of wielding this love, as demonstrated by the self-proclaimed preacher of love, Scopogaban. We are on the cusp of entering a whole new era of One Piece. Because if the idea of willpower can be manifested into tangible smacks in the face, then why not love? Which could very well be the counter to the power of the Abyss, the Mark of Emu, a man-thing who is lacking the love of his precious Nefertari D. Lily, thus making the Abyss more of a deadly metaphor for Emu's own innate emptiness, and hence why Scopogaban may be able to break the Abyss by mixing in a little bit of love. But it is incredibly important to note that Scopogaban is not the first old man to show us the power of love. That title, as well as almost every other title, would belong to Monkey D. Garp, whose self-proclaimed fist of love is arguably even more terrifying than his regular fists of general punching. And this fearsome love has not gone unnoticed by fans over the years. In the SBS of Volume 62, a curious reader wanted to know exactly what happened on Water 7 when Garp arrived and punched Luffy, which negated his devil fruit abilities. Now, the obvious, but in this case wrong answer to this would be HAKI. However, it is something else. In Volume 45, when Garp punched Luffy, why did it work? Was it HAKI after all, or was it love? To which Oda responded, it is love in this case. And when it comes to Luffy, probably in all other cases as well. Luffy has stated in the past, nothing is more painful than Grandpa's fist, and while it could be because Garp was using HAKI on his rubber grandson at a very young age, it's more likely that Garp was using love, which is even worse. And that Garp may very well be one of the most powerful people on this planet, not just because of raw meat strength and not just because of the willpower of HAKI, but because he can harness the power of love. At the time, and really up until very recently, this Garp phenomena was brushed off as a gag, because similar things have happened in the past. Nami is another character capable of negating Luffy's abilities, and the same question was once asked of her as well. Blows shouldn't hurt Luffy, so why does he get bruises and swelling when Nami and the others beat the crap out of him? Tell me! And tell me Oda did do. When the crew beats up on each other, it's always an admonishment with a strong sense of purpose, which is why it works so well. It works on his spirit. I bet Nami is thinking, it's his spirit that hurts deep down, right? I guess not. And even though Oda did the very classic thing of negating his answer right at the end of his answer, I think it's still very much on point. Nami is able to hurt Luffy's spirit. And one theory as to why it's actually possible for Nami to hurt Luffy is because it's actually Luffy's ability that's allowing it. Gear 5th is the power for Luffy to bring his imagination into reality, and that's not always a good thing, with bits of it having been seeping through long before the full awakening. And so a fun explanation is that Nami can only hurt Luffy because Luffy believes that she can. And that's a very unique thing about One Piece that I bring up quite often. Just because something is a joke doesn't mean you can dismiss it, because wacky jokes are very real fictional power sources. And when it comes to love, I have to say, this is far from a joke at this point, which we can clearly see in the love god himself, Sanji. During one of Sanji's finest moments on Egghead Island, he leapt into battle combat against Admiral Kizaru to protect one Jewelry Bonnie, and he shocked tout le monde by actually managing to block Kizaru's attack. And mate, just look at Kizaru's face in response to this. That should tell you everything you need to know about how insane this maneuver was, and Sanji's explanation for this phenomena was that love is stronger than light. Kizaru replies by saying that if that were true, then physics as we know it is dead. And I think I'm here to confirm that fictional physics as we know it is indeed dead. When I was reading this weekly, I very much brushed it off as a gag. Ha ha ha, your classic Sanji simpy white knight moment, where sure, love may have been inspiring his interactions, but we know that what actually allowed him to block Kizaru were his awakened Germa modifications. But the more we explore the final saga, the more I realize just how wrong I was. Or if I was right, it was the right answer with the wrong working. Back on Whole Cake Island, Sanji and sister of Sanji, Reiju, had a lovely heart-to-heart after Reiju's memory assault, where she stated that her mother gave her life to protect the emotions that Sanji was born with, and that's why he was born kinder and gentler than anyone. And so whilst Judge and Sanji Sanji's brothers considered Sanji to be the Germa's greatest failure, Reiju and Sora consider Sanji to be the greatest success of the Germa. There's also been a long time semi-comical theory that Sanji is overly amorous because he has the emotions that his brothers are missing. So whenever he feels love, anger, sadness, or sees a woman that makes his bread rise, Sanji feels those emotions 4 times harder than any other human, and while that mostly manifests itself in a wide array of horny jokes, it is true of every emotion. When Sanji gets angry, he gets so angry that he catches on fire. Not always in a funny way either, in a very literal way. This isn't just anime visual license happening, Sanji is actually catching fire. And I quite like this idea because it means that Sanji not only received the superhuman modifications that Judge tried to embed him with, but the greatest modification he received was from his mother Sora. That heavily increased access to emotion, which made Sanji kinder and gentler than anyone. And this is something I believe that Sanji has since gone on to embrace as his modification. During his fight against S-Shark, Sanji quite proudly tanked a shark fist to the face with his modifications, and he stated, "What would you know about the power of love?" And when I saw this, I did the same thing. At the time, I wrote this off as Sanji being a tiny bit delusional, almost in denial about his modifications and trying to supplement that with his own preferred reality. But I think that Sanji is actually onto something here, whether he realizes it or not. And given the idea that he has access to a well of emotion that others simply cannot dive deeply enough into, perhaps Sanji was born particularly sensitive to the power of love, in the same way that characters like Enel or Isa were born with the gift of observation HAKI. There was just something within both of them that allowed them to tap into that power much easier than most. Because Sanji has been saying stuff like this throughout all of the One Piece. And speaking of Skype here, that brings up one of the greater examples. During Sanji's first ordeal of balls, with the second one being the 2-year time skip on Momoiro Island, Sanji cracked it at Satoru and he said, "Anyway, dumpling guy, you keep harping about challenge this and challenge that. Frankly, I couldn't care less about your stupid rules, but considering that there are a couple of damsels waiting for me to rescue them, I accept your so-called vassal's challenge, but you should know I have my own challenge, a love challenge," which has also been translated as an ordeal of love or a trial of love, both of which I prefer. But whatever he says, it's promptly made fun of by Luffy and Usopp later on because they cannot feel what Sanji can feel. In this moment, it is entirely possible that Sanji is genuinely tapping into the power of love to defeat with his feet Satoru, and that he is able to see a very special aspect of this world that even the greatest of HAKI users may be completely blind to. And what I love about this is that the power of love is something that Judge never even came close to considering. His whole scientific career has been dedicated to creating the ultimate battle warrior, and it turns out that he completely scientifically castrated himself by focusing on the removal of emotions, and thus losing access to one of the greatest powers that a human being is capable of conjuring. And as a side note, Judge, by modifying his sons to be completely subservient, also may have taken away their ability to tap into HAKI, because they have no real willpower of their own to exercise, and so Judge has ended up creating an objectively inferior version of humanity with none of its greatest strengths, and that's why they're pretty useless without the raid suits to compensate. And when Sora begged Judge not to erase the hearts of her children because they wouldn't be human anymore, Judge replied with this: "Monsters they should be. All that matters is for us to win in war, and I will bestow upon my children the greatest power possible." And look, that philosophy is scarily similar to what Saint Summers is trying to enact on Elbaf. All that matters is winning the war. Everything else is irrelevant and even counterproductive to that end, be it education, happiness, and most definitely, love. And in fact, what's very clear is that Summers sees love as the ultimate weakness of life. I'm not going to go through his whole speech again because I've done that enough times on this channel, but Summers is currently on Elbaf trying to exploit the weakness that is love. In his scenario, he's specifically focusing on parental love and exploiting this emotion to have parents essentially end their own lives in an attempt to save their children. And it's very tempting to think that the ones being bound here are the children by the literal thorns, but what's also happening is Summers binding the parents and the adults with the love for their children. And with what we've been exploring in this video so far, that is a very dangerous idea for Saint Summers to be playing with. It's like a kid messing around with fire without understanding the true power of fire as one of nature's greatest forces. And I do think that's quite an apt comparison, as love in One Piece tends to be compared to fire quite a bit, especially through ideas of burning passion. The difference being that most people respect fire, or at the very least they understand it, which is why the Holy Knights are actually trying to use it as we speak. But the world nobles, they do not understand love. To Saint Summers, it's curiosity, a human phenomena that tickles his mind brain. But love is a big problem for the world government because it is the only power source that they are not capable of harnessing. They can exert their willpower and manifest HAKI. They can consume devil fruits and wield the dreams of humanity. They can commandeer an army of pacifists and turn them into a legion of war. And they can even steal an ancient weapon and put it to work doing, well, I'm not actually sure what it's doing because every island it's ever targeted never existed in the first place. But the power of love is something they could never take. And even worse, they could never corrupt or erase it because, mate, they have tried and failed miserably. Big man Bartholomew Kuma is our proof of this, and his demonstration of love left even Dr. Vegapunk in complete scientific and spiritual bewilderment. After Kuma's shell arrived at Egghead Island to save Bonnie, Vegapunk had an epiphany, a once-in-a-lifetime breakthrough, and he said to himself, "I attached a total shutdown switch to you, and now that it's been thrown, you should have been in a total vegetative state, without the ability to act of your own free will or even carry out orders. There's no reason he should have sprung into motion, and no logical scientific basis for his arrival at this island where Bonnie is. So is it true then? Is it not the physical strength of the Buccaneers that makes them remarkable? For at one point in time, we don't know, because then Vegapunk gets cut off before he can drop that big lore bombshell. But this inner monologue is very revealing because it's actually kind of indirectly referencing HAKI. In the One Piece world, there is this primary focus on willpower, which is to be expected because any character can literally manifest their own will into an assortment of superhuman abilities. And so Saint Saturn's directions to Vegapunk were to strip Kuma of his willpower, thinking that that would completely deplete him of any ability in this world. And when Egghead was being published weekly, I believe I was guilty of the willpower misconception. Watching Kuma make his way to Egghead Island felt like another classic case of raw drive and willpower getting him there, very One Piece push through the pain. But Vegapunk is definitely hinting at something else. Because Kuma has no will of his own. It was taken away. However, what Saint Saturn, the world government as a whole, and even Dr. Vegapunk may have neglected is the power of love. Something that we've explored many examples of in this video already, and a lot of those examples could be mistaken for willpower, but Bartholomew Kuma is about as close as we can get to objective proof that love can be used as an individual power source all on its own. It's something currently beyond the understanding of science, not just by Saturn, not just by Judge, but even by Vegapunk, who didn't even conceive of the idea until moments before his death. And what's really interesting to me is that while the world nobles can't grasp love, that may not necessarily be true of Emu himself. In fact, it almost certainly isn't, given how we've seen Emu pine over his portrait of Nefertari D. Lily and his subsequent obsession with Vivi. And it may well be the case that the entire last 800 years of the One Piece world have been dictated by Emu's love for Lily, making it the most powerful and influential source on the planet, but not for very good reasons. And so it makes a lot of thematic sense that Emu is connected with the idea of the abyss, because abyss is just a fancy way of saying limitless emptiness, and perhaps that is exactly what Emu is without love. He is an empty, silhouetted shell, and should the power of love be real, then it would be very thematically appropriate for it to be a potential counter to abyss-related abilities. Hence why Squappa Gaban may be able to do stuff like slice the arm off Saint Summers and it not regenerating, or at least it hasn't regenerated at the time of recording this video. And that would be pretty exciting because it would mean that Sanji is the Straw Hat in the greatest position to take on the Holy Knights, but also depending on Brook's connection to Gunko, there may be a love thread developing there as well, which brings us to Boa Hancock. You'll see why that makes sense in a bit. Because what makes me very unsure about this topic is that, sure, the power of love is a fantastic ability for Sanji to wield, but it doesn't at face value seem like a good natural fit for Luffy. And assumedly, Luffy will need to counter this abyss power at some stage. Even if we significantly widen the definition of love to something beyond a connection to another person, let's say the love of adventure, the love of freedom, or the love of other broad concepts, even then I'm still not sure if it feels right for Luffy. Although maybe it is, and there'll be some cool panels in the future of Luffy using his grandfather's fist of love. But even if Luffy never wields it himself, it has and will continue to be used in his favor, hence Boa Hancock. With love sickness being a very real condition in the One Piece world which can genuinely result in death, and Luffy has strongly benefited from the power of love afflicting Boa Hancock, with former Empress Gloriosa describing it as, "This is a stroke of luck, Monkey D. Luffy. Will he be the one to move this mountain?" Implying that love is the only force in this world that could have broken through Boa Hancock's sheer stubbornness, her willpower, her HAKI. And Gloriosa also used a common phrase from East Blue being, "Love is always a hurricane," which I've always found interesting because it sounds very similar to the idea of the will of D always causing a storm. The will of D being another one of those intangible abilities in the One Piece world. It can't, or at least so far, it hasn't been quantified or harnessed, but it is a power that certainly exists. And with love, this does seem to be an enduring motif for the final saga of One Piece. It has never been in more focus than on Egghead Island with Bonnie and Kuma, and on Elbaf with everyone, all of its residents. And I do have a theory for why this is. I think it may be because this is the final run for One Piece. The last opportunity that Oda will have a stage this large to say something important to him. And One Piece is now about leaving a legacy for the future. Oda started drawing the series as a teenager, and he will be concluding it as the father of 2 adults. Oda started writing this manga in the position of Luffy, as the young man setting out on a grand adventure, but he's concluding it in the position of a parent, a mentor in the One Piece world. Soon, Oda's generation will be moving on, and it'll be time for his children to begin inheriting and shaping the world. And that is reflected in One Piece with our focus on the generation to come after Luffy. Luffy's adventure has yet to conclude, but we are getting real close, and soon it will be time to pass that torch, with one major message for the final saga and a message of hope for the future being that love conquers all.